I am Anna Marie, 28 years old now, but I was only 8 when my parents abandoned me on my grandmother Eleanor's doorstep. They vanished for 20 years until the day of her funeral last month. They showed up out of nowhere, crying crocodile tears over her casket, eyeing her $50 million estate. My mother had the audacity to say, "We are her only family." That is when the lawyer stood up. Where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had family betray you for money. My childhood started normally enough. I remember our modest 2-bedroom house with the yellow kitchen where my mother Diana would make blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning. My father Richard would swing me around in the backyard until I was dizzy with laughter. We were not wealthy, but there was always enough food on the table and presents under the Christmas tree. I had no reason to believe anything would change. The first signs appeared when I was around 6. My father started coming home later and later. His eyes became perpetually bloodshot and hushed arguments would wake me in the night. I would sit at the top of the stairs, hugging my stuffed rabbit Clara, listening to my mother cry about credit card bills and missed mortgage payments. My father would promise it was the last time that he would stop gambling, that things would get better. They did not. By the time I turned 7, bill collectors called constantly. My mother started selling our furniture piece by piece. My toys disappeared without explanation. The pancake sundaes stopped. My father rarely came home, and when he did, he and my mother would scream at each other until their voices were hoarse. The night they left me at my grandmother Eleanor's house is etched into my memory with painful clarity. It was raining, the kind of heavy downpour that made the world outside the car windows blur into streaks of color. My father drove in tense silence while my mother kept turning around to smile at me reassuringly. They had packed a small suitcase with my clothes and told me we were going on an adventure. "Just for a little while, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice overly bright. "You will stay with Grandma Eleanor while Mommy and Daddy figure some things out." I had only met my grandmother a handful of times. She lived in a large mansion on the outskirts of town. My parents rarely spoke about her, and when they did, it was usually my father complaining about how controlling she was, how she had never believed he was good enough. When we arrived at the imposing iron gates of her estate, my stomach was in knots. My father pressed the intercom button, announced our arrival in a strained voice, and the gates slowly swung open. The long driveway seemed to stretch forever before we reached the enormous house with columns flanking the entrance. My grandmother answered the door herself, surprise evident on her face. She was tall and elegant in a silk robe. Despite the late hour, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Richard, Diana, what is going on?" Her eyes fell on me in the back seat, clutching my small suitcase and rabbit. My father cleared his throat. "Mother, we need a favor. We have to go away for a bit to sort out some business opportunities. Anna Marie needs a place to stay for a week or 2. My grandmother's face hardened as she looked between my parents. Something unspoken passed between them. "Come inside, Anna Marie," she said finally, holding out her hand to me. "Let us get you dry." I climbed out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through my coat. My mother knelt down and hugged me tightly. "Be good for Grandma, okay? We will be back before you know it." Her voice cracked, and now I recognize it was because she knew she was lying. My father awkwardly patted my head. "Listen to your grandmother. We will call soon." I stood in the doorway with my grandmother watching, as they drove away, the red taillights disappearing into the stormy night. That was the last time I saw them for 20 years. Inside, my grandmother led me to a guest bedroom larger than our entire living room at home. She helped me change into dry pajamas and tucked me into bed with a gentleness I had not expected from such a formidable woman. "Your parents need some time," she said carefully. "But I am here, and we will be fine together." The first few days I kept asking when my parents would call. The first few weeks I would run to the phone whenever it rang. My grandmother tried to distract me with baking cookies and exploring the huge house, but I could see the worry in her eyes whenever I asked about my parents. After a month, a letter arrived with no return address. My grandmother read it privately, then sat me down and explained that my parents needed to be away longer than expected. She did not show me the letter. Later, I learned it contained only demands for money and not a single question about my well-being. The promised phone calls never came. More months passed, and the letters became less frequent until they stopped altogether. My grandmother enrolled me in a new school. She bought me new clothes and toys. She created a beautiful bedroom for me, painted lavender, with a canopy bed fit for a princess. But nothing could fill the void my parents had left. My first birthday without them was the hardest. My grandmother arranged a small party with kids from my new school, but when it came time to blow out the candles, I broke down sobbing. I had wished for my parents to come back. My grandmother held me all night as I cried myself to sleep. Gradually, Eleanor became both grandmother and parent to me. She established new traditions to help me heal. Friday movie nights with homemade popcorn. Saturday morning garden walks where she taught me the names of all her flowers. Sunday afternoon drives along the coast in her vintage Cadillac. She was not a naturally affectionate woman, but she tried her best to fill my life with love and stability. Sometimes she told me one night as she braided my hair, "The family we choose is more important than the family we are born into. You and I, Anna Marie, we are choosing each other." Adjusting to life in my grandmother's mansion was like learning to navigate a different world. Everything was bigger, more formal, more expensive. My bedroom had its own bathroom with marble countertops. The dining room could seat 20 people. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with more books than I could read in a lifetime. A housekeeper named Martha came 3 times a week, and a gardener named Thomas tended the sprawling grounds. At first, I felt like an intruder in this grand space, afraid to touch anything for fear of breaking something valuable. I would sit stiffly on the edge of sofas and use my best manners at meals. My grandmother noticed and took me aside one afternoon. "This is your home now, Anna Marie," she said firmly. "You can put your feet on the furniture. You can slide down the banister if you want to. A house is just a building without people living fully inside it." Slowly, I began to relax and make the space my own. My art projects appeared on the refrigerator. My books mingled with hers in the library. My laughter echoed through rooms that had been quiet for too long. I came to learn that my grandmother Eleanor was something of a legend in the business world. She had built a textile empire from scratch in an era when female executives were rare. Starting with a single small factory producing specialty fabrics, she had expanded into a corporation with manufacturing facilities in 7 states. She had invented a waterproofing technique that revolutionized outdoor clothing and made her first million before she turned 30. By the time she semi-retired, Eleanor Textiles employed over 2,000 people. "I built something that will outlast me," she told me one day, as she showed me newspaper clippings and awards from her career. "That is what I want to teach you. How to create something meaningful with your life." My grandmother may have retired from the day-to-day operations of her company, but she never stopped working entirely. 3 days a week, she disappeared into her home office for conference calls and meetings. Sometimes she would bring me in and let me draw at a small desk while she worked, explaining business concepts in simple terms I could understand. "Assets and liabilities, profit margins, supply chains," she would say. "These are just fancy words for simple ideas. Business is about making something people need and delivering it with integrity." School was difficult at first. The private academy my grandmother enrolled me in was filled with wealthy children who had known each other since kindergarten. My secondhand clothes and public school background made me an immediate outsider. Some kids whispered about how I had been abandoned, their rumors growing more fantastical with each telling. I heard her parents were criminals who went to jail. No, they ran away to Europe with stolen money. I heard they sold her to her grandmother. The bullying reached its peak when a girl named Heather loudly asked during lunch if my parents had left because they did not love me. I ran from the cafeteria in tears, and hid in a bathroom stall until a girl named Sophia crawled under the door to sit with me. Heather is a jerk to everyone, Sophia said, offering me a chocolate bar from her pocket. Last year, she made fun of me because my dad lost his job. Want to come over to my house after school? My mom makes the best snickerdoodles. Sophia became my first real friend and protector. She taught me how to ignore the bullies and introduced me to her circle of friends who were kind and accepting. With her help, school gradually became bearable then enjoyable. Art became my therapy and passion. I discovered I had a talent for painting when my grandmother enrolled me in summer art classes. Something about the way colors blended on canvas helped me express feelings I could not put into words. My early works were all dark landscapes with stormy skies, but as years passed, light began to appear in my paintings. When my grandmother saw how serious I was about art, she converted the attic into a studio for my 13th birthday. Large windows were installed to let in natural light. Easels, canvases, professional-grade paints, and brushes appeared. A small sitting area with comfortable chairs allowed my grandmother to keep me company while I worked. "You have a gift," she told me as I explored the studio for the first time, tears in my eyes. Gifts must be nurtured, not ignored. Together, Eleanor and I created our own family traditions. Sunday brunches became elaborate affairs where she taught me to make her famous blueberry scones. For Christmas, we would volunteer at a local shelter before returning home to exchange gifts by the fire. On her birthday, I would paint her portrait, creating a gallery of her aging gracefully through the years. When I was 16, my grandmother's health began to decline. It started with small things she tried to hide from me. Shortness of breath climbing the stairs, forgetting words mid-sentence, napping more frequently in the afternoons. I pretended not to notice because it terrified me to think of losing her too. By my senior year of high school, she needed a cane to walk and had hired a part-time nurse named Gina to help with her medications. College decisions loomed, and though I received acceptance letters from prestigious art schools across the country, I could not bear the thought of moving far from my grandmother. "You will go to Rhode Island School of Design," she insisted, when she found me looking at applications for local community colleges. "It is the best for what you want to study. I will not have you sacrificing your future to babysit an old woman." "But what if something happens while I am away?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. My grandmother took my hands in hers. "Life comes with no guarantees, Anna Marie. The only certainty is that I will always be proud of you, whether I am here to say it or not." We compromised. I would attend RISD as she wished, but I would come home every other weekend and call her daily. It was an arrangement that allowed me to pursue my dreams while still being present for the woman who had saved me in every way a person can be saved. During winter break of my sophomore year of college, I discovered the truth about my parents. I had returned home to find my grandmother having good and bad days. On her good days, we would bake cookies and watch old movies. On her bad days, she would rest in her room while I caught up on coursework in the library. One afternoon, while searching for a book, I accidentally knocked over a box on the top shelf of my grandmother's study. Photographs and letters spilled across the carpet. As I gathered them up, I noticed they were pictures of my parents, some I had never seen before. My mother in a wedding dress. My father in a business suit shaking hands with my grandmother. The three of them in a hospital room, a newborn me bundled in a blanket. Among the photos were letters, dozens of them all from my parents. With shaking hands, I unfolded the first one, dated just 2 months after they had left me. "Eleanor, we need money again. Richard has a sure thing this time, a real investment opportunity that will solve everything. 20,000 should cover it. We know you have it. If you refuse, you will never see us or Anna Marie again. Your choice, Diana." I read letter after letter, each more desperate and threatening than the last. They demanded money for gambling debts, for business ventures, for bail bonds. They blamed my grandmother for their problems. They used me as leverage, sometimes promising to come back for me if she paid, other times threatening to disappear with me if she did not. The final letter, dated about a year after they left, chilled me to the bone. You win, Eleanor. Keep her. We are moving west to start over. Send the last 10,000 and you will never hear from us again. Consider it the price of your precious granddaughter. I sat on the floor, surrounded by this evidence of my parents' true nature, until my grandmother found me there, tear-streaked and silent. You were never supposed to see those, she said, softly lowering herself carefully to sit beside me. They sold me, I whispered. They literally sold me to you. My grandmother sighed deeply. It was more complicated than that, though not much better. She gathered the letters into her lap. Your father had a gambling addiction for years before you were born. Your mother enabled him, always believing his promises that the next bet would solve everything. They inherited a substantial amount when your grandfather died, and I watched them burn through it in less than 5 years. She showed me another letter I had missed, this one from her to them. I cut them off financially when you were about 6. I told Richard I would not fund his addiction anymore, that he needed help. I offered to pay for rehabilitation programs, therapy, anything that would actually address the problem. He refused. Is that why they left me with you? Because you stopped giving them money? I asked, my voice small. Partly, my grandmother admitted. The final straw came when Richard took out loans from dangerous people. When he could not repay, they threatened your family. Your parents came to me begging for $50,000 to pay off these men. I agreed on one condition: Richard would enter treatment for his addiction. She showed me another letter, this one in my father's handwriting, full of rage and blame. He refused. They decided to leave town quickly instead, to run from the debt. The plan was always to leave you with me temporarily while they established themselves somewhere new with the money I gave them. But I suspect once they had the cash in hand, once they were free of responsibility, they chose not to come back. I felt physically ill, so they just decided they did not want me anymore, that I was too much trouble. My grandmother took my hand. Addiction is a terrible disease, Anna Marie. It warps people, makes them unrecognizable versions of themselves. The people who left you here were not the same people who joyfully brought you home from the hospital as a baby. Did they ever ask about me? In all those letters demanding money, did they ever once ask how I was doing? I needed to know, though the answer would hurt either way. My grandmother hesitated, then shook her head. Number. And that is why I stopped responding eventually. I realized no amount of money would make them the parents you deserved. Why did you not tell me all this years ago? I asked, anger finally breaking through my shock. I thought I was protecting you, she replied. What good would it have done for an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, even a 16-year-old to know her parents had chosen money over her? I kept hoping that someday they would get help, would become people worthy of knowing you again. I kept the door open for their redemption, but they never walked through it. I stood up abruptly, needing to be away from the letters from her, from the truth. You had no right to keep this from me. You let me spend years wondering what I did wrong, why they did not love me enough to stay or even call. You let me build them up in my imagination as people who must have had some noble reason for leaving. I ran from the room, from the house, into the winter garden, where I collapsed on a cold stone bench. Hours passed as I sat there, processing years of lies and abandonment. The sun set, and still, I sat until my grandmother appeared with a blanket that she wrapped around my shoulders before sitting beside me. I made a mistake, she said simply. I thought I was sparing you pain, but I was really sparing myself the difficulty of watching you face it. I should have told you the truth, in an age-appropriate way. I should have helped you process it, rather than letting you wonder. I am deeply sorry, Anna Marie. Her admission deflated my anger, leaving only sadness in its wake. I spent so many years thinking there was something wrong with me, something that made me unlovable to them. There was nothing wrong with you, my grandmother said fiercely. The failure was entirely theirs. You were, are, and always will be worthy of love and commitment. What they did reflects only on them, never on you. We sat in silence for a long time before I asked the question that had been building in me since I found the letters. Do you know where they are now? No, she answered honestly. The last communication was that final letter. I hired a private investigator years ago to make sure they were alive at least. He found them in Arizona. Your father was working at a car dealership, your mother as a waitress. They had not improved their circumstances. They had no other children. Something about that last detail brought me a strange comfort. At least there was not another child out there experiencing what I had. I am not sure I can forgive you yet, I told my grandmother. But I understand why you did it, and I still love you. She nodded, tears in her eyes. That is more than I deserve. Thank you. We walked back to the house together. Our relationship changed, but not broken. 2 weeks later, she was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months to a year. All thoughts of the past were set aside as we faced this new, more immediate crisis together. The cancer moved faster than anyone predicted. Within weeks of her diagnosis, my grandmother needed a wheelchair to move around the house. I took a leave of absence from art school and moved back home permanently to care for her. My professors were understanding, allowing me to complete some coursework remotely, but my education became secondary to spending whatever time I had left with Eleanor. We established a new routine. Mornings were for medications and doctor's appointments. Afternoons, when she had the most energy, were for activities she enjoyed. I would wheel her through the garden in good weather, or set up an easel by her bed so I could paint while she read or napped. Evenings were for conversations deeper and more honest than we had ever had before. I never told you about my first love, she said one night as I brushed her thinning hair. His name was Thomas. Not the gardener, though. That is why I hired him. The shared name amused me. My Thomas was a soldier shipping out to Vietnam. We promised to marry when he returned. He never did. Another evening I was terrified when I found out I was pregnant with your father. I was 36, divorced from a brief disaster of a marriage, and running a company in an era when pregnant executives were unheard of. I wore increasingly large blazers and scheduled no photos for 6 months. These stories were gifts, pieces of herself she had kept private until now. I absorbed them all, asking questions, learning who my grandmother truly was, beyond the formidable businesswoman and unexpected parent she had been to me. In return, I shared my own secrets, my fears about my artistic talent, the relationship with a fellow art student that had ended painfully, my worry that I would inherit my father's addictive tendencies, the reason I never drank alcohol. You are stronger than he ever was, she told me. You face your fears instead of running from them. That makes all the difference. As her physical strength declined, my grandmother became increasingly concerned with practical matters. She insisted on meeting with her attorney, Marcus Wilson, multiple times. Marcus was a distinguished man in his 60s who had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for decades. He would arrive in an immaculate suit, his leather briefcase filled with documents for her to review and sign. These meetings always took place privately. My grandmother would ask me to give them the room, and I would occupy myself elsewhere in the house until Marcus left, often an hour or more later. When I would return, my grandmother would be exhausted but satisfied, as if she had completed an important task. What are you and Marcus discussing for so long? I asked, after one particularly lengthy session. Ensuring everything is in order, she replied vaguely. There is nothing more important than having your affairs properly arranged before you depart. Is it about your will? I asked directly. Because I do not care about any of that. I just want you to focus on treatment, on getting better. My grandmother reached for my hand. We both know I am not getting better, dear heart. And yes, we are discussing my will, among other things. There are complications I need Marcus to address. What complications? Is there something I can help with? She hesitated, then said, You need to be prepared for what might happen after I am gone. Your parents may resurface. The mention of my parents sent a cold shock through me. Why would they? They have not cared for 20 years. Money changes things, she said simply. People who have shown no interest in family can suddenly become very sentimental when inheritance is involved. You think they will try to claim some of your estate, I realized. After everything they did, it is a possibility we need to prepare for, she confirmed. Marcus is helping me ensure my wishes are legally unassailable. What are your wishes? I asked. She smiled faintly. You will know when the time comes. Just promise me something. When you hear the full truth, remember that every decision I made was out of love for you. You are scaring me with all this mystery, I told her. No need for fear, she assured me. Marcus will make sure everything happens as it should. Trust him as I do. As spring turned to summer, my grandmother's condition deteriorated rapidly. Hospice nurses began coming daily then, around the clock. The medication kept her comfortable but increasingly disconnected from reality. She would drift in and out of lucidity, sometimes mistaking me for my father, sometimes for her sister who had died years before I was born. In her final week, she had a day of surprising clarity, as often happens just before the end. I was sitting by her bedside reading aloud from Jane Austen, her favorite, when she suddenly reached for my hand. Anna Marie, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. I need to ask your forgiveness. For what? I asked, setting the book aside. For not fighting harder to keep your parents involved in your life. I was so angry at them, so disgusted by their choices, that I may have closed doors that should have stayed open. I shook my head. You did everything you could. They made their choices. Perhaps, she said. But I wonder sometimes if my pride made things worse. Richard and I, we were always too similar, both stubborn to a fault. When he refused treatment, I should have found another way to help him. You offered them money, support, everything, I reminded her. They chose to leave me. That is not on you. She squeezed my hand weakly. You have grown into such an extraordinary woman. Strong, talented, compassionate. I am so proud of the person you have become despite the wounds you carry. Because of you, I told her, tears flowing freely. Everything good in me came from you. No, she shook her head slightly. It was always in you. I just created the space for it to flourish. She closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. Remember what I told you about family. The family we choose is more important than the family we are born into, I recited. She smiled faintly. Yes. But also remember that forgiveness is not about absolving others of responsibility. It is about freeing yourself from the burden of anger. That night, with me holding her hand and the hospice nurse checking vitals, Eleanor slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The nurse noted the time of death as 3:17 a.m. I sat with her body until dawn, talking to her, telling her all the things I had forgotten to say while she could hear them. In the days that followed, I moved through funeral arrangements in a fog of grief. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. The house that had become my home now felt cavernous and empty without my grandmother's presence. I slept in her room, surrounded by her scent that was already beginning to fade. I wore her robe. I talked to her photographs. I was lost without her guidance, her strength, her love. My grandmother had left detailed instructions for her funeral. She wanted a simple, elegant service at the small stone chapel where she had occasionally attended services. No black, she specified, but rather navy blue or deep purple, classical music instead of hymns, readings from literature rather than scripture, and white roses, hundreds of them, her favorite flower. The day of the funeral dawned clear and warm, a beautiful June morning that felt wrong for such a sad occasion. Martha, the housekeeper who had been with us for years, helped me dress in a navy blue suit that my grandmother had actually picked out and purchased months before. in one of her final acts of preparation. "You look lovely," Martha said, fastening a pearl necklace that had belonged to Eleanor around my neck. She would be proud. Sophia arrived early to support me, having flown in from Chicago, where she now worked as an architect. She had been my rock through the illness, calling daily when she could not be present physically. Now she held my hand as people began to arrive for the service. The chapel filled quickly. Business associates, employees, neighbors, and friends all came to pay their respects. The mayor attended, as did several state representatives who had worked with my grandmother on economic development initiatives. Her impact on the community was evident in the diversity and number of mourners. Marcus Wilson arrived in his customary impeccable suit, carrying the worn leather briefcase I had seen so often. He greeted me with a gentle hug. "Everything is arranged as she wished," he assured me. "The service and everything that follows." I nodded, not entirely sure what he meant by the latter part, but trusting my grandmother's confidence in him. As the service was about to begin, a commotion at the back of the chapel drew everyone's attention. A man and woman were making their way down the center aisle, dressed in expensive but ill-fitting clothes that suggested a hasty purchase. The woman's makeup was streaked with tears that seemed to appear on cue as people turned to look at her. I did not recognize them at first. 20 years had changed them significantly. My father's once thick, dark hair was now gray and sparse. My mother's slender figure had thickened, her face lined and harder than I remembered. But when she looked directly at me, I knew immediately. Those were the same eyes that had promised to return soon as they left me on a rainy night 2 decades ago. "Oh, Anna Marie," she cried out, rushing toward me with outstretched arms. "Our baby girl all grown up." I froze, unable to process what was happening. Sophia stepped protectively in front of me while Marcus moved swiftly to intercept my parents. Diana Richard Marcus greeted them with professional neutrality. "This is unexpected." "We came as soon as we heard about Mother," my father said, his voice carrying through the now silent chapel. "We have been trying to reconnect with the family for years, but she kept us away." This blatant lie stunned me out of my shock. "That is not true," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "You abandoned me. You never called, never wrote." My mother pressed a hand to her chest dramatically. "Is that what she told you?" "Oh, sweetheart, your grandmother kept your letters from us, returned our calls. We tried so hard to reach you." People were watching this exchange with uncomfortable fascination. The minister stood awkwardly at the pulpit, unsure whether to proceed. "Perhaps this is a conversation best held privately after the service," Marcus suggested firmly. My father nodded with false solemnity. "Of course. We would not want to disrupt Mother's funeral. We loved her dearly despite our differences." They took seats in the front row directly across from me, as if they had every right to be there. My mother continued to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief, while my father put his arm around her comfortingly. The performance was flawless, and I could see several attendees watching them sympathetically. The service began, but I barely heard the readings or music. My mind was racing, trying to understand why they had appeared now after all this time. My grandmother's warning echoed in my thoughts. Money changes things. When the minister invited family members to share memories, my mother stood before I could process what was happening. She walked to the pulpit, adjusted the microphone, and smiled tearfully at the assembly. Eleanor was not just my mother-in-law, but a second mother to me. She began, her voice trembling perfectly. Though we had our differences over the years, family was always most important to her. She would be so happy to see us all together today. Her only son, her daughter-in-law, and her beloved granddaughter. We are her only family after all. The words were like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, my vision narrowing as panic began to set in. The audacity of her claiming family connection, of rewriting our history so brazenly in front of people who had no way of knowing the truth, was overwhelming. Sophia squeezed my hand tightly, grounding me. "Breathe," she whispered. "Just breathe." My mother continued her fabricated eulogy, painting a picture of a close family, temporarily separated by circumstances beyond their control, now reunited in grief. When she finally returned to her seat, my father stood to add his own fictional memories. I could not bear to listen. I whispered to Sophia that I needed air and slipped out a side door into a small anteroom. Leaning against the cool stone wall, I tried to control my breathing and the nausea rising in my throat. Sophia followed me, standing guard outside the bathroom door when I was sick. "They are lying," I gasped when I could speak again. "Everything they are saying is a lie." "I know," Sophia soothed, wetting a paper towel to press against my forehead. "Everyone who really knew Eleanor knows the truth. The rest do not matter." "Why are they here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Money," Sophia said bluntly. "They must have heard about her estate." We returned to the chapel just as the service was concluding. My parents had positioned themselves by the exit, accepting condolences as if they were the chief mourners. My father had his arm around my mother, who was leaning into him weakly as if overcome with grief. I avoided them by remaining in my seat until most people had left. Marcus stayed nearby, watching the situation carefully. When only a handful of close friends remained, my parents approached me directly. "Anna Marie, we have so much to catch up on," my mother said, reaching for my hands. I pulled away before she could touch me. 20 years worth," I replied coldly. "Starting with why you abandoned me without a single call or letter, then show up the moment my grandmother dies." "That is not fair," my father interjected. "Your grandmother turned you against us. She always wanted you for herself." "Is that why you sold me to her for $10,000? I asked, watching their faces carefully. The momentary flash of surprise told me everything. "That is a terrible thing to say," my mother gasped. "We would never." Marcus stepped forward. "Perhaps this conversation should continue at the house. The will reading is scheduled for 5 o'clock. As Eleanor's attorney, I need to inform you that she left specific instructions regarding today's events." My father's expression changed, subtly becoming more focused, more calculating. Of course, we would not miss it. As they turned to leave, I heard my father mutter to my mother, "50 million. Can you believe it? We just need to play nice for a few hours." They had not come for me. They had not come for my grandmother. They had come for what they thought they could take from us one last time. The gathering in my grandmother's study that afternoon was small but tense. I sat in a leather armchair near the fireplace, Sophia beside me for moral support. My parents took the sofa directly across, still maintaining their grieving facade, though with no one but me to perform, for they were less committed to the act. Martha had prepared refreshments that sat untouched on the coffee table between us. Marcus Wilson arranged his papers on my grandmother's desk, methodical and unhurried. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence. "Before we begin," my father said impatiently, "I want to state for the record that, as Eleanor's only child, I expect the estate to be handled appropriately according to family succession." Marcus looked up from his papers with an unreadable expression. "Everything will be handled according to Eleanor's explicit wishes, Richard. I can assure you of that." My mother leaned forward. "We understand Anna Marie has been living here, and of course we would never displace our daughter. But as the legal next of kin, there are matters of business control and financial assets that naturally should transfer to us." I could not believe their transparency. Not even a full day since reconnecting with their abandoned daughter, and they were already laying claim to everything my grandmother had built. "Perhaps we should simply proceed with the reading," Marcus suggested, putting on his reading glasses. Eleanor left very specific instructions about how this meeting should be conducted. He opened a sealed envelope and removed several documents. "First, let me clarify the extent of the estate. Eleanor's total assets, including property, business holdings, investments, and personal effects, are valued at approximately $53 million. My father exhaled sharply, unable to hide his reaction to the specific number. My mother squeezed his knee in warning, but her eyes had lit up as well. Before detailing the distribution of assets, Marcus continued, Eleanor requested that I play a recording. He removed a small digital recorder from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. This was made 3 months ago, when Eleanor was still of sound mind as documented by her physicians. He pressed play, and my grandmother's voice filled the room. Though weakened by illness, her characteristic strength came through clearly. Richard and Diana, if you are hearing this, you have done exactly as I predicted. You have ignored your daughter for 20 years, then appeared at my funeral with claims of family connection. Before my attorney reveals the contents of my will, I want you to know that I am fully aware of your motivations. My father shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. You abandoned Anna Marie on my doorstep when she was 8 years old. You took the money I provided for her care and disappeared. The private investigator I hired documented your movements to Arizona, your new identities, your continued gambling, and financial mismanagement. Most damningly, I have preserved the final letter you sent, stating explicitly that you were selling access to your daughter for $10,000. My mother's face had gone pale. My father's jaw clenched. For 20 years, I kept track of you from a distance. Not once did you inquire about Anna Marie's well-being. Not once did you send a birthday card or Christmas gift. Not once did you demonstrate even the most basic parental concern. Instead, you left me to explain to a heartbroken child why her parents never came back as promised. Tears ran down my face as I listened to my grandmother's voice, imagining her planning this moment, ensuring the truth would be heard even after she was gone. I raised your daughter to be everything you are not: honest, compassionate, hardworking, and brave. She has become an extraordinary woman despite your abandonment, not because of it. She deserves everything I have built while you deserve nothing. There was a pause, then her voice continued, softer now. Anna Marie, my darling girl, forgive me for the theatrics of this recording. I wanted to ensure the truth was spoken aloud, that your parents would have to face what they did to you with no opportunity to rewrite history. I love you beyond measure. Everything I have is yours to use in creating the beautiful life you deserve. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Marcus cleared his throat. Now to the specific terms of the will. My father stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. She was clearly not of sound mind when she made those accusations. We will contest this entire proceeding. I strongly advise against that course of action, Marcus replied calmly. In addition to the recording you just heard, I have extensive documentation of your abandonment of Anna Marie, including the original letters you sent demanding money. Eleanor anticipated your reaction and prepared accordingly. You cannot just cut out the legal heir, my mother protested. Richard is her son. There are laws about disinheriting children. Indeed, there are, Marcus agreed, which is why Eleanor did not disinherit Richard entirely. He turned a page in the document before him. To my son, Richard Harrison, I leave the sum of $1 and my profound disappointment in the man he became. My father's face flushed dark red. This is outrageous. I will fight this with every lawyer I can find. You are welcome to try, Marcus said, unfazed. However, Eleanor established an irrevocable trust for the bulk of her estate 5 years ago with Anna Marie as the sole beneficiary. The house, the business interests, the investment portfolios, all of it was legally transferred long before her death. There is technically very little passing through the will itself, making your grounds for contest virtually non-existent. She cannot do that, my mother said, her voice rising. That is our inheritance. It was Eleanor's to distribute as she saw fit, Marcus corrected. And she saw fit to ensure it went to the family member who stood by her, not the one who abandoned both her and his own daughter. My father turned to me, his expression suddenly conciliatory. Anna Marie, sweetheart, surely you can see this is not right. We are your parents. We had problems, yes, but we never stopped loving you. Your grandmother poisoned you against us. We can be a family again, work together to manage the estate, as Eleanor would have wanted. The transparent attempt to manipulate me after everything I had just heard was the final straw. I stood finding strength in my grandmother's posthumous support. "You are not my family," I said clearly. "You forfeited that right 20 years ago when you drove away without looking back." My grandmother was my family. She taught me that family shows up, family stays. Family chooses love over money every single time. "You ungrateful little," my father began, but Marcus interrupted. "That is quite enough, Richard. If you have nothing constructive to add, I suggest you and Diana leave. The security team has been instructed to escort you from the property if necessary." Only then did I notice the two men in suits standing discreetly by the door, another precaution my grandmother had arranged. My parents gathered their belongings, the pretense of grief entirely abandoned now. At the door, my mother turned back. "This is not over," she said, her voice hard. "You will hear from our lawyers." After they left, Marcus explained the full details of my inheritance. Beyond the monetary value my grandmother had left, letters explaining her business decisions, her hopes for the company's future, and her confidence in my ability to either manage it or select appropriate leadership. She had arranged for a board of trusted advisors to help me navigate the transition. Everything had been meticulously planned to protect me and her legacy. "She spent her final months ensuring you would be secure," Marcus told me. "Not just financially, but legally protected from exactly the scenario that played out today." "Will they really contest the will?" I asked. "They may try," he acknowledged, "but they will fail. Eleanor was nothing, if not thorough. The trust is ironclad, and we have abundant evidence of abandonment. They have no case, only desperate greed." As he packed up his briefcase, Marcus handed me one final envelope. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this privately. Her last words for you alone." That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in my grandmother's garden and opened her final letter. Inside was a handwritten note and a small key. "My dearest Anna Marie, if you are reading this, you have faced your parents and their inevitable attempt to claim what they never earned. I am sorry to have put you through that ordeal, but I needed them to hear the truth to face the consequences of their choices one last time." The key enclosed opens the small safe behind the portrait in my bedroom. Inside, you will find my most treasured possessions, including my mother's jewelry and my personal journals. But most importantly, you will find the deed to a small cottage on the coast that no one knows about. It is my gift to you, a sanctuary away from everything when you need peace. Whatever you choose to do with the business, the money, the house, know that I trust you completely. Create the life that brings you joy. Help others when you can. And remember that you were always loved completely and unconditionally by me. All my love now, and always, Grandma Eleanor." I clutched the letter to my heart and looked up at the stars, feeling her presence around me despite her absence. For the first time since her death, I felt something beyond grief. I felt purpose. As my grandmother had predicted, my parents filed a lawsuit contesting the will and the trust arrangement. For 6 exhausting months, I found myself embroiled in legal proceedings, forced to relive the abandonment as their attorneys attempted to paint a different picture of what had happened 20 years ago. They claimed my grandmother had manipulated the situation, had turned me against them, had prevented them from maintaining contact. They produced fabricated evidence of attempts to call and visit that had been rebuffed. They argued that my father, as the only child of Eleanor, was entitled to at least a portion of her estate regardless of their estrangement. Marcus and his team methodically dismantled each claim. They presented the original letters demanding money. They called the private investigator who had tracked my parents to Arizona, who testified about their new lives with no attempts to contact me. Most damaging to their case, they produced school records, showing I had waited at the front office every Friday for months after being abandoned because my parents had promised to call calls that never came. In the end, the judge dismissed their case entirely. The evidence clearly shows abandonment of both the minor child and the deceased, he stated in his ruling. The plaintiff forfeited any moral claim to inheritance through his actions, and the deceased was within her legal rights to establish the trust as she did. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, after the final hearing, my parents approached me one last time. They had aged during the proceedings, the stress of the case, and their defeat evident in their faces. "You could still make this right," my father said, his tone somewhere between pleading and demanding. "You have more money than you could ever spend. We are still your parents." I looked at them both, really looked at them, seeing not the monsters of my childhood memories, nor the greedy caricatures of recent months, but simply two flawed, broken people who had made terrible choices. "I do not wish you harm," I said finally. "I hope you find peace and happiness somehow, but it will not be through my inheritance or in my life. You chose your path 20 years ago. I have chosen mine." "So that is it?" my mother asked bitterly. "You turn your back on us just like your grandmother taught you." "No," I corrected her. "I am setting boundaries just like my grandmother taught me. There is a difference. I forgive you both, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I will not carry the burden of your choices or your bitterness any longer." I walked away then, not looking back, just as they had done to me all those years ago. But unlike them, I was walking toward something, not away from responsibility. In the year that followed, I slowly rebuilt my life with intention and purpose. The first decision was about Eleanor Textiles. After much consideration and consultation with the advisory board, I chose to maintain ownership but hired experienced executives to handle day-to-day operations. I established a scholarship program for employees' children and improved benefits across the company, honoring my grandmother's belief in taking care of the people who contributed to her success. The mansion held too many memories, both painful and precious. Rather than selling it, I donated it to the city to be used as a cultural center, with the library preserved exactly as my grandmother had left it. I renovated the carriage house on the property as my private residence, close enough to feel connected to the legacy, but separate enough to be truly mine. The cottage on the coast became my creative sanctuary. I converted the sun porch into a painting studio and spent weekends there healing through art. My work began to attract attention in galleries focusing on themes of abandonment, forgiveness, and chosen family. I donated the proceeds from my first major show to organizations supporting children in foster care. Most significantly, I established the Eleanor Foundation with $10 million of my inheritance. The foundation's mission was twofold: to provide art therapy programs for children who had experienced abandonment or loss, and to fund addiction treatment for parents at risk of losing their families to substance abuse. It was my way of addressing both sides of my own story, breaking the cycle that had cost me my parents. On the first anniversary of my grandmother's death, I visited her grave with white roses, her favorite. As I arranged them in the simple vase embedded in her headstone, I spoke to her as if she could hear. "I think you would be proud of what I have done with your legacy," I said softly. "The business is thriving. The foundation has already helped dozens of families stay together. My art is finally becoming what I always hoped it could be." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree shading her grave, and I smiled at the timing. "I found your journals," I continued. "I know now why you were so determined to help me heal from being abandoned. Your parents sent you to boarding school at 7 and rarely saw you again. You broke the cycle with my father trying to be the parent you never had, and then you did the same for me when he failed. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for showing me that family is not just blood, but choice and commitment." I sat on the small bench beside her grave, watching clouds drift across the blue sky. I am not alone anymore. I have Sophia and her family who have taken me in as one of their own. I have Marcus who checks on me regularly. I have the foundation team who share my vision. I have students in my art therapy classes who look to me for guidance. You taught me how to build a chosen family, and I have. As I prepared to leave, I placed my hand on her headstone one last time. I love you, Grandma. I am going to be okay. And I was. The abandoned child left on a doorstep had become a woman with purpose, surrounded by people who chose to stay, who chose love over convenience or obligation. My grandmother's final gift had not been the money or property, but the example she set of rising above painful circumstances to create meaning and connection. Have you ever had to choose forgiveness for your own peace even when someone did not deserve it? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey of overcoming abandonment to find strength resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that family is more than blood. It is a choice we make every day. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, our greatest power is choosing how we respond to the hand we are dealt.